I was doing some research for materials to do a second version of the roll-up chair, and I came across this really cool material. This is a bendable plywood, and just like its name, it's plywood that bends. There are other names that it goes by, like wiggle board or column wrap or bendy board, but I started playing around with it and I made it into this shape, and I was like, this kind of already looks like a chair. So yeah, I want to try to make a chair that looks like that. I started out by making the form that I'll use to bend the plywood. And to cut out the shape of the form, I'm going to use a new toy, the Shaper Origin. This is probably the coolest thing that I have ever used. Full disclosure, it's not sponsored, but they did send it to me. It's kind of on loan though, so I'm not sure if I'm gonna get to keep it. I kind of have to come up with ways to see if it's useful. So I'm really just going to be testing this thing out and sharing the whole process along with you guys, and you'll get to learn along with me. So I've only made 3 cuts with this thing so far. This is going to be my 4th cut ever making with it. So let's get into it. This is a handheld CNC. Instead of taking up a large footprint in your shop, you can cut out perfect shapes just like using a handheld router. But the machine needs to know where it is in the world, and that's what this tape is for. After plugging it in, the first thing you need to do is scan the workspace so it knows what it's looking at. Then you can design shapes and joinery on the tool itself, or what I'm doing here, I uploaded a shape I designed on my computer. And then you just have to decide where to place that shape on your workspace. Once selected, you set your cut depth, press Z-touch, which determines how far the end of the bit is from your material, and you're ready to cut. It's really that easy. I seriously thought I was going to have to spend a whole day to figure this thing out, but it's actually super easy to set up and understand. Now, all you have to do is run the router like you normally would, and the machine auto-corrects itself to stay on the line. It's just so cool. And just like that, I have a perfect shape for my form. So if I wanted to make this shape without the Shaper Origin, I would have used a circle jig, and I would have only done it on this half, and then these edges I would use some sort of straight edge guide. So it's totally doable without that tool, but it kind of just makes it perfect from the computer, which is kind of cool. So I don't need to do that twice for the second part of this form. I could just take this one and use this as my template for how to cut the second one. And I think that's where this Origin is really going to shine, with templates. So after rough cutting on the bandsaw, I used double-sided tape to temporarily attach the first piece to the second piece, and used a flush trim bit to clean that all up. I brought it outside to try and limit how dusty my shop was going to get. Yeah, that doesn't last long. Now I have both ends of my form cut to shape. I can cut all the 2x4s that I'm going to use to make the rest of the form. Some of them just needed to be ripped down, and those skinnier pieces will go by the curvy part of the form. Putting the form together was fairly simple. Just laid everything out where it was supposed to go, pre-drilled and countersunk some holes, then locked the 2x4s in place with screws, flipped it over, repeat the process. Cool. I'll cover this up with a layer of this bendable plywood, and this is going to act as the base of this whole form. But it's dinner time, so I'll have to continue this another day. All right, so slept on it, and I realized that because I'm going to be putting so much force in this area over here when I tie everything down, I think that I should reinforce this bottom section over here. So I'm going to add a few more pieces of 2x4s to the bottom. All right, onto the bendable plywood. Not easy to maneuver around the shop at all, and a bit tricky to cut, but I trimmed it to length and tacked it onto the form with a gajillion brad nails. That sheet of bendy plywood was only a 4x4 sheet, so it wasn't long enough to cover the whole form. So I just filled it in with that cutoff piece, hoping that this would work out okay. For making the form, I used a 4x4 sheet that I was easily able to find from one of the big box stores and have it delivered to my house. But as you saw, it wasn't big enough to make the size chair that I want to make. I could make a smaller chair, but I want to make a normal size chair. So I had to source this larger 4x8 sheet. And I found it at my local hardwood dealer. But there's just one thing to note when you're looking for something like this. You can get them in two different ways. So this one here, it bends this way. And there's another way that you can get it where it bends this way. So one is called barrel wrap and one called, what's it called? And column wrap. One's called barrel wrap and column wrap, or they also go by 4x8 sheets or 8x4 sheets. And depending on where you're getting it from, they're going to label it in different ways. I think this one was just called a barrel wrap. So I'm going to cut these to size now. I don't need the full 8-foot width of these sheets, so I cut them all at once using the Tracksaw and totally was not expecting to need to climb up on the table to finish that cut. Again, managing these at the table saw was tricky for sure, but doable. Time to glue them up. I drilled a hole in the form that was big enough to hold a clamp, placed the form on a platform which I will be able to reach under. You'll see why in a bit. Then I just poured a ton of glue on the sheet. I decided to use a glue that has extended working time since I figured that this might take me a while to get in place. I used a roller to make sure the glue was evenly spread on the sheet and placed it on the form. Repeated the same process to the second sheet, and the third and last sheet did not get any glue. It just goes right on top. Before gluing, I made center lines on the form and the sheet so I can easily line everything up, and started adding the ratchet straps. Obviously, I went into full-on panic mode during this process. It was kind of crazy, but I did do a test run without glue, so it was less crazy than it could have been. How long did that take me? That was only 10 minutes. Okay. That felt like an hour. Okay. Shoot, forgot to line the form with something that will not make the whole thing stick to it. I really hope no glue got in there. Oh my god. Okay. I meant to line it all with wax paper. Oh, I really hope it doesn't mess up. Okay. Even with a test run, I forgot something. Anyway, while that's set up, I worked on the actual seat of the chair. I'm going to use butternut veneer on the whole curved part, so decided to make this seat out of butternut as well. If you're interested in a full-depth video on how I mill rough lumber without a jointer, I have a whole separate video on that. Click that lowercase I that's in the corner of this video, or check out the link in the description box below. So my lumberyard only had 8-quarter butternut in stock, but I didn't want the seat to be that thick, so I resawed the boards at the bandsaw, making 4 thinner boards out of 2 thicker boards. I decided to glue this up in stages so that I could get a really flat glue up. So first I only glued 2 boards at a time and set that all to dry. All right, I have been totally procrastinating and trying to avoid taking the clamps off of this. I just gotta do it. Okay. I was so nervous with how this was going to turn out because it was my first time ever doing any sort of bent lamination like this. I'm so scared. Ah! Oh my god. Okay. Oh. Oh. It worked! Almost a chair. Okay. That was just too exciting. All right, moving on to the veneer. I wanted to experiment with using raw veneers because I've never used them before. I've only used Paperback and shop sawn, which are thicker. Okay, now I have some decisions to make here. Not exactly sure what my next step is going to be. So I know that I want to veneer the inside and the outside, but there's a few things to think about here. So should I do this at the same time, or should I do this in stages? If I do this in stages, I would do the veneer on the inside first, then do all of my joinery, and I can do joinery from the outside in, and then afterwards I can cover it up with the outer layer of veneer, and it would be cool. And the other option is to veneer both sides right now, then do all the joinery, potentially put joinery in here so that you can't see it, or have some exposed joinery on the outside, which could be cool. So there's positives and negatives to either one of these ways. If I do them both right now, it's going to be easier for me to trim everything to final dimensions because it's going to be lighter. But I won't be able to do any joinery on the outside without it being exposed. And if I do it in stages, it's going to be heavier to work with and harder to work with once everything is all in place to trim everything to final dimensions. But it would be cool to have all the joinery coming in from the outside and then cover it up with the outer layer of veneer. So, not really sure what I'm going to do just yet. I guess we'll find out in a moment. All right, so I went inside, had a snack, and made two decisions. So first I'm going to do this in stages. So I'll veneer the inside, do all the joinery, and then veneer the outside to cover anything up. And second decision is that I'm not going to use that raw veneer on the inside because the form that I made, the edges are not smooth and they don't fit perfectly around the chair. There's like a slight gap because of how I made this shape. And if I were to put the raw veneers in there with glue, it will get all wrinkly because there's not sufficient pressure. So I happen to have had this piece of paper-backed veneer that I'll have to just apply with some contact cement, and the outside I'll use the raw veneer. So the process for applying paperback veneer is pretty simple. Apply contact cement to both the veneer and your workpiece, wait for them both to dry, then apply the veneer using pressure to make sure that everything is stuck on there and there are no air bubbles. Simple when it's a flat surface, that is. So normally you can place scraps under the whole sheet of veneer and slowly remove them as you press the veneer in place.
Oh boy.
Yeah, kind of hard to do on the inside of a curve. This is yet another part of this build that was kind of crazy, and I promise you it won't be the last. So the glue is dry on the two halves of the seat, and I can send them through the planer to make them perfectly flat. I could just use glue again to assemble the rest of it, but then I wouldn't get to use my cool new mini mortising jig. I'm making these mortises for some loose tenons. These aren't really going to be adding any strength. They're just going to make the two halves of the seat be perfectly aligned since it's too wide to send through my planer after the glue up. Set that off to dry. Back to the main part of the chair, I used an electric planer just to level off the uneven glue up there so I can make measurements from a straight line. It's still oversized at this point, and I'll cut it to final dimension after the outer veneer is on. You guys saw earlier how the chair didn't end up the same exact shape as the form. There was that tiny gap right where the curve ended. So I couldn't use that form to get the shape of the seat. I needed to make a new template based on the actual shape of the chair. So I rough cut some MDF at the bandsaw and sanded it until it fit. Nice. The glue on the seat is all set up, and I could use that template to mark out the shape. Well, ½ inch larger than that shape because it's going to be recessed into the chair. Once again, rough cut at the bandsaw and sand to final shape. I cut a scrap 4x4 so I can get an accurate placement for the top of the seat using the template I cut earlier as my guide, then used a scrap from the actual seat and some of the bendy ply to mark out where the bottom of the seat will go. All right, so when I first started this, I was like, oh, just make a dado or a groove inside a curved piece, easy. No, there's a lot of stuff that I need to think about here. So the most important thing, or the hardest thing to deal with, is that when the router is going to be on the flat part over here, the bit is going to be at a certain depth. but then when it's on the curved parts, it's going to be raised up a little bit because of these 2 points of contact over here are creating a gap. So I set 2 different depth settings on the turret here to accommodate for that. Hopefully that works. I also made a spacer piece that's the distance between the edge of the bit and the edge of the router. And I thought that I was going to just put 2 guides on here, one on one side, one on the other side, and in between there would be the perfect size groove or dado. But this piece is actually kind of hard to get on straight. So there's no way that I would be able to get on 2 of them that are going to be perfectly spaced apart. So I made this little spacer that if I put this on the edge of the router, that's going to make the perfect size dado or groove. I did a few test cuts and it fit pretty well. So I hope this works out, but not gonna lie to you, I am super scared to make this cut right now. I told you this video was going to get even crazier. So I used double-sided tape to attach the bendy plywood at the correct location for my cut line, and then went to town with my router. I started by only doing the straight parts that are on the sides. And you'll notice here that I'm doing a stop dado or groove or whatever you want to call it, because I thought I was going to notch the edges of the seat. I'll explain this a bit further in a bit. So the flat sides were easy. It was that middle curve that was bonkers. It took me a few passes to figure out where the best place to hold the router was. Actually, I don't think I figured that part out at all in the end. None of this felt natural. And after doing a few passes at the same depth as the sides, I switched the depth stop to go deeper and only went to that deeper depth on the inside of the curve. Time for a second pass to widen the groove or dado. I just used some CA glue on that spacer piece and attached it to the edge of my router. Don't worry, it's just temporary. It's going to come off later. But see how it just nudges the router over the perfect amount? Cool. I set the depth back to the first, more shallow setting and repeated the whole process over again. Shallow setting on the flats, shallow setting in the curve, then change to the deeper setting inside the curve. While I do this crazy task, let's take a quick break to talk about this week's sponsor, Audible. Audible is the #1 source for spoken word entertainment. But today let's talk specifically about the Audible Plus membership. Did you know that you could try Audible Plus free for 30 days? Here's what you'll find when you do. Thousands of audiobooks, podcasts, and Audible originals across so many different genres. You guys may or may not know this, but besides for woodworking, music is one of my passions. And recently, I've been taking my guitar playing more seriously. I came across this title on Audible called My First Guitar by Julia Crow, and it's amazing. It contains interviews from some of the greatest guitar players of all time, like Jimmy Page, Les Paul, and Carlos Santana, and they discuss how they got their first guitars and everything that inspired and motivated them to become the icons that they are. As someone who's trying to learn to play guitar better, this was insanely inspiring. If you love music and want to hear how some of the greats got started, I highly recommend it. And you can listen to it when you try Audible Plus free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/Tamar or text Tamar to 500-500. Once again, that's audible.com/Tamar, Tamar, my name, or text my name, Tamar, to 500-500. Thanks, Audible. Now back to the crazy routing. Woo. All right. Okay. So there's this one area right here where the curve just starts to change. So if I would have went full depth in the curve part, it would be too deep. So I kind of just like stopped a little shy of it, and I'll take a little router plane and I'll get everything to be all the same depth. Looks like I'll have to change the plan again. So I originally thought that I was going to be able to slide this in because there was some flex in here. But once I tried to slide it in, if I would try to push that any further, I think this whole thing will crack. So I don't want to push any harder. I was going to notch this out so it would sit really nicely, whatever. Now what I'm going to have to do is extend the dado or the groove and slide it in that way. But I want to then cover it up. So I want to preserve the veneer that's on here. So I'll try to cut that out and do a little surgery and then glue it back in after the fact. Spoiler alert, I didn't end up using this piece, but the step of removing it actually helped give me a guide for my router. I figured it was faster to route close to the line and then clean it up with a chisel than it would have been to set up guides again, and for me, it was. This seat just needed some final sanding, and I could do the test fit. Clearly, I am very excited about this chair. So the seat. I purposefully made the grain running from side to side because it will expand and contract with the seasons from the front to the back within the chair. So I'm actually not going to glue the whole seat in. I'll only put glue at the front areas when I slide the seat in. And I won't push it all the way to the back. I'll leave some room for the seat to expand and contract into the back of the chair, but the front will always remain in the same position. So I slid the seat in place halfway, then put the glue on, and then slid the seat in the rest of the way. Well, just shy of the rest of the way. I want to make sure the seat stays in that position in the front, so I drilled some holes from the outside through the seat and glued in some dowels. Repeated the same thing to the other side. I've been sitting here for a while trying to clean up all that stuff that was on the back of the veneer that I salvaged, and it's taken me a while, and I realized that I already have a piece of the butternut from the seat that's the perfect thickness for that groove that I made. So this is going to be way easier to do than to have to glue in a scrap and then glue this on top of that, whatever. This would definitely be more seamless, but I really don't think anyone's going to notice this one little spot, so I'm gonna go with what's easier right now. It would have been cool if I could use that piece, but it just didn't seem worth the effort when I can use something easier that will look just as good. After ripping those pieces to the correct width, I glued and clamped them in place, and when the glue dried, I could cut them flush, along with cutting the dowels flush. Well, I got them mostly flush and then sanded the whole back to prepare it for the veneer. This time I'll be using the raw veneer. So the prep work is a little different here. Paperback veneer is easier to work with, but is way more expensive. So I was really hoping that I could figure out this whole raw veneer process. First thing I'll need is a straight edge. So I planed a long board of poplar until it was straight. Then I laid out the veneer in the pattern that I wanted and trimmed them to rough length with a utility knife. I'll be using a veneer saw along that straight edge to trim the veneers. And I want these cuts to be as straight as possible, which means that straight edge can't move on me. So I put some adhesive back sandpaper on the bottom of it to make sure that the straight edge didn't slide around, and I started cutting. From what I've read, they suggest doing this in multiple light passes, so that's what I did. And it was actually really easy and fun to do, and I totally enjoyed this part of the process. It was really fun. Once trimmed, you want to put painter's tape on the back side of the veneers, meaning the side you don't want to see. This tape is only temporary, and it's only there to hold the pieces in place while you put the veneer tape on the front side or the face side. So I flipped the whole thing over once the painter's tape was applied, and then applied the veneer tape on the front. The veneer tape is tricky, so you need to wet it with a sponge in order to activate the adhesive. And your fingers are all wet, and then you go and touch the roll, and everything sticks to you. Next time, I will definitely pre-cut the veneer tape so that that doesn't happen again. So you place it going across the seams every 4 inches or so, and then one long one going down the whole seam. I tried to remove any excess water with a paper towel and place something on the seam so it stays flat, and I let that set up for a bit. The chair needed some extra support because I'm going to use the ratchet straps again, so I added a 4x4 block on both sides. The veneer tape is set up and dry, so I flipped the whole thing over to remove the painter's tape from the back side. And then I put glue all over the outside of the chair. I'm using veneer glue here, not regular yellow glue. I rolled it on and placed the veneer where I wanted it, this time remembering to add the wax paper. And all I had left over from the bendable plywood were these scraps, so I made do. I just placed ratchet straps over each section of the scrap and the ply, and I also added an extra caul right where the curve ended. And this is what I totally should have done on that first glue up of the main chair. Oh well. Really nervous to see what this looks like underneath here. I really hope this worked out. And I'm smiling, so it worked. The veneer tape was just a bit tricky to get off. I felt like I had to put on an uncomfortable amount of water on it in order to loosen up the adhesive, but that's what the manufacturer said to do. Okay, time to trim everything and make it look pretty. I used the Tracksaw to cut off the excess depth, I guess is the correct dimension here, whatever. The edges that were hanging over, I made them nice and square. So this whole time I thought I was going to cut it to final height at the table saw, but I did a practice run of that and it did not feel safe at all. So I used double-sided tape on a scrap piece of that bendy plywood once again and attached it all around the back side. This acted as an edge guide for a circular saw. I did this in 2 passes just to get the cleanest cut possible, and I did this on both the top and the bottom, and I was really impressed with how it worked out. Except for those front corners, they're just a bit too sharp for my liking. So I whipped out the origin again and made a little curved template that I could double side tape to the side of the chair, rough cut with the jigsaw, and then flush trim with a flush trim bit. Nice. Just some finishing touches like sanding with a high grit so I don't bust through the veneer, small roundovers on all the edges to soften everything up, then prepare the edge for finishing. I thought I was going to make edge banding this whole time, but then changed my mind and decided to paint the edges instead. There were some voids in my bent lamination, so I used some spackle instead of wood filler to fill those voids because it's easier to apply and it sands easier as well. I then applied 2 coats of this earth green milk paint. And this is my first time using milk paint, by the way. It has a really interesting consistency, but I think it looks cool. Once that was dry, removed all the tape, lightly sanded all the edges again just to clean it all up, topped it all off with some walrus oil furniture finish, and just look at that butternut. It's just so good. So I think that this is a win. I set out to make a chair out of the bendable plywood, and I did. And I think it looks pretty cool, but I don't think that I would build it this way again. The ratchet straps were okay, not great. For future bent laminations like this, I'm going to make 2 forms. The inside, like I made, and an outside form as well, so it closes everything really tight. And I think that's going to be the way to go from now on. Also, the veneers. I've done enough veneering now without having a vacuum press that I think it's time for a vacuum press. Again, the results are okay, but they're not perfect. If you run your hand along it, there are ripples in some spots because of the lack of sufficient pressure. So I'm going to be looking for a vacuum press. I think it's going to be the best way to get better results. So huge thanks to WOODCRAFT and Audible for sponsoring this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. What did I get myself into? Oh. All right, just stop procrastinating. Just do it. You got this. If anyone was just wondering what that sound was, I just had to blow some bees away. I love spring, but I hate the bees. Where is my chisel? Where is my chisel? Where is my chisel?